Hello, you're listening to the Project Catalyst podcast with me, Kim Clyden. Today, what is soil health? Why is crop rotation important? How do you get it right? These are all questions you may have asked in an effort to learn more about improving the soil in your paddock or even your garden. In our third episode today, adopting organic principles to build soil carbon, I'd like to introduce Adam Wilson. Adam's interest in what lies beneath follows a lifelong pursuit that began with agronomy, then composting, and resulted in him growing organic food for market. Today, he shares his global perspective that formed his view on the links between our farming methods and the degradation of our soils.
When we were in Romania, it was particularly noticeable that where the modern agriculture had come into the southern parts, where there was large, expansive agricultural enterprises. Yes, they were efficient. Yes, they were broad, lots of machinery, but the number of crops was quite small, down to like half a dozen crops. Whereas when you go to the north of Romania, into the smaller villages and that, the colour was much more greener because there's lots of trees and windbreaks and stuff. But you're looking at crop numbers around about 30 and 40. And so for me, the diversity was starkly different between the southern and the northern part of Romania.
So you're talking about 30 and 40 varieties on one farm?
Yeah, of course. In fact, the workers would leave the villages and walk a couple of k's out of town, and then they'd be doing the work in the market gardens. And then at the end of the day, they come back home or, lunchtime or whenever they had a break. And you just notice that, and of course the flavours when you eat the food is quite noticeable as well.
Farming itself spans many different industries, from dairy to beef production to pigs and sheep, and of course then you've got your horticultural endeavours, your herbs. How difficult is it to assist people with natural processes and more traditional farming methods across those really broad industries?
It's come to light really in the last few months with the price of fertilisers going through the roof. That's when people start to have that wake-up moment. And it happened, 10 years ago. We had really high prices of oil. The oil went through the roof, price of fertilisers went up, and of course people had to transition towards more natural practices because they've got to get the gross margin right. It's the cost of what you're getting for your product, and then you've got to subtract the cost of production. So that is a linchpin. I always start at that point, what are you getting for your product? What's it costing you to produce that product, and can we make measured changes to that to improve both the quality of the food and, more importantly, the returns to the farmer?
Well, given the number of monocultures we grow, what are some of the greatest challenges when you're looking at broad acre farming?
It's the diversity of the rotations is really important. I mean, we can have big paddocks, there's no trouble with that. The issue is whether or not we can have the rotations, and we have tended to go into cropping after cropping after cropping of the same species. But the better farmers around the world are the ones who are breaking that, having long-term rotations, whether it be 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 10-year rotations. And that's when you start to market multiple different crops at any one time. And this is what I mentioned last night about the integrated farming practices. This is where the opportunity for Australia really lies. It's been able to tie in both your cropping together with livestock, so that at any one point the grower is not single point sensitive. And that's the issue today, is that when you grow just one crop and the tide turns against you in that crop, you're caught with your pants down. And, this adds to the level of depression in agricultural society, is that, when they're caught with their pants down, suddenly as a provider for the family, you can't do that anymore. You feel as though you've failed. In reality is you just haven't got the right design on your farming enterprise so that you can handle the good and the bad times.
Well, much of the coastline of Queensland is taken up with sugarcane production. And in fact, a lot of that market is actually governed by industry bodies. So those farmers have contractual agreements to fulfill. How much does that factor into this transitioning to diversity in crops?
It's a critical component. If you look at places like Brazil, where they've got the flexibility of moving between sugar production and ethanol production, that is where we strategically as a country need to move towards, so that at any one time, if the sugar prices are good, we can pour it into sugar production. But if the sugar prices are bad and ethanol is starting to pick up in price, we can flip it into ethanol production. Rotation's critical here. It's a critical component for soil health. And more importantly, to stop the sediment and the organic compounds that are soluble in water that often leave our landscape. Now, the average soil erosion rate in Australia is 4 tonne to the hectare. That equates to about 0.3 of a millimetre of soil a year. Now, that's not much. That's hardly a fingernail. So we're losing that either in sediment or organic compounds, and that's the bit we have to slow down. And the way to slow that down is to have really good organic carbon in our soil, quality carbon. And at the moment when fertiliser prices are so high, this is the time to start seriously looking at how can we find other alternatives to replacing those nutrient costs on the farm. And one of the best ways of doing this is through composting. And this then gets into a much larger strategic design for our country, is that we have huge amounts of waste that come out of the cities. We're not properly splitting that waste up into what we call the putrescibles, which is the green material that can break down. We certainly don't do a very good job on our recyclables. And then the rest that's left, we just dump it into a big plastic-filled hole and hope that we can capture a bit of methane from that, but knowing full well, the ones that actually understand this process, that plastic lining will break at some point, and that's going to get into aquifers, and whether it be 50 years or 200 years in time, it's going to leak in and it's going to cause another environmental disaster. Why don't we look seriously at the way the Germans are looking now, and that is that we recycle everything that comes in as waste. The stuff that's combustible, we burn on the green grid so it becomes a green source of power. And then the highly toxic stuff is filtered and then encase it in marbles, like silicon dioxide. In other words, once you've encased those highly toxic stuff into marbles, it'll be there for millions of years. Now that's a much better strategic way. And then we can take those putrescibles, compost them, and return them to the areas like sugarcane where, once it's properly composted, bang, it starts building the soil up. You can protect the reef a lot better. You can stop that sediment movement. But this is what I mean by integrated thinking. Integrated farming practice also comes into integrated thinking and how we have a vision for the country. At the moment, we have very little long-term vision for this country, but it's clearly there. There's an opportunity. With regards to energy, and I think the Germans are really up there. With regards to how we manage our soils, we have some really clever people in this country. I mean, we need to look at strategic designing of all our catchments. And I think natural sequence farming, Taran Park Training does a really good job there. That's strategically looking at how we move nutrient across the landscape, how we stop water from dissipating and draining our landscape. That's part of the answer. I think also there's countless farmers out there that are doing great jobs on their farms. And these need to be showcased, But clearly the most important thing for this region is to work on those growers that are doing a fantastic job and showcasing them, which is essentially what you're trying to do here, is to identify those really good growers.
Project Catalyst has more than 130 people who've been part of the program for more than 10 years. And I think that says something about the practices that some of them have been adopted industry-wide. However, they're now embracing multi-species cover crops and even intercropping, which they've been a bit resistant to because change is difficult for humans overall. How would you suggest that people could actually adopt those types of initiatives in their farming practice? Because I think a lot of it preventing people is they have this fear of losing yield or losing money.
Yes, so this is a perfect time to do this because at the moment the fertiliser prices are through the roof. So we've got to look at other ways to keep the farming enterprise moving forward. And as a group, I mean, here's an example of what you could do. You could purchase as a group for a 100 horsepower tractor a compost turner. And you could utilise the local resources that are in this area, and you could set up composting and get that nutrient out to the local community and service both a recycling component in your regional area and, more importantly, providing a really good quality compost for the growers to use.
Why couldn't we use something like the green waste recycled compost?
We could use the green waste. It'll just take longer to break that down. because you've got difficult components in there. You've got all the clippings from around the region and that, all the eucalypts and the palm fronds and all that, and they just take time to break down. And you'd have to monitor them for heavy metals and what we call, in the organic industry, it's what we call the OCs, OPs and heavy metals, the organophosphates, organic chlorides and the heavy metals. So you want to do a test to make sure what you're putting back on the land is not contaminated. And you can easily do that in the screening process up front. So you select the best materials. It's always about, you can make material, you can make good compost from great ingredients, but you've got to be careful that you don't select material that's a higher risk down the track for you.
Well, further north, there have been some trials conducted under Project Catalyst, taking out hymenacne and things like that from our waterways, composting it onto land and adding other dry matter, and then returning that to the farm. You've worked in the industry. What have you been able to identify as, the best types of compost for the sugar industry to use?
Anything that's green and rotting. So, as you said, all those materials that are building up in the waterways, they can easily be raked and combined. There's thousands of tonnes of that material. You've got sources of manures. You don't want to have too much manure in there because you don't want to have elevated phosphorus levels. Phosphorus is also a serious problem. You want all your nutrients attached to organic compounds so that they don't easily move away in a rain event. And as you build your organic carbon in your soil, what happens is you're building the ability of that soil to absorb the first impact of the rain. Most of the time when we get our rain events now, compared to like 10, 15 years ago, our rain events now are getting sharper and heavier, right? So we need to have that soil protected, and the only way to do that is through quality organic carbon, and compost is a great way of doing that.
Looking at the sugar industry itself, how important is it for that to be organic, and what benefits would there be if they moved into purely organic or certified organic sugar production?
Well, we don't have to move in a complete certified organic direction. This is a really key point here. It's not about trying to convert everybody into organic farming. That's not the point. But what we're trying to do is adopt the organic principles, and they are about building soil carbon, diversity, rotations, remineralisation. They're all really key components, and every farmer can adopt them at different stages. They can mix their fertilisers into a good quality compost, therefore it doesn't leach as easily and you get better bang for your dollar. It's not about seeing the light and converting. It's not a revelation, it's not a religious experience here. It's about practical step-by-step processes. In the end, you end up solving what at the moment are serious problems. Large-scale movement of water and nutrient off the farm and leading into ecosystems that are highly vulnerable and yet have huge economic value. The Great Barrier Reef is a huge economic value, and you just can't treat it the way we've been treating it. We have to have a bit of a mindset change.
So how do we then convert that to broader adoption of the things farmers are doing, like our Project Catalyst growers?
If we just start with one simple thing, like you're doing EM surveys across the landscape here, which is a great tool. You'd get an initial mapping of what the changes are in the soil types. Then you take soil tests from those areas, and then you identify those areas where you can change the makeup of the fertiliser and the organic components that you add to that soil based on the soil type. And that then strategically gets you into what we call a prescription compost for each region. And you can combine that with both an organic compost together with your fertilisers that you want to use, and therefore you get better return on investment. And that's what it's all about at the moment. If you look at the gross margins for sugarcane at the moment, they're going to be difficult, going forward because of the price of fertilisers. And all it needs is a switch in the international price of sugar, and the whole community is really caught with their pants down. So you don't want that in the equation.
I'm pretty sure they've already been there. What difference have you seen composting make on broadacre farms or big farming initiatives, that may have had challenges adopting that type of thinking?
Yeah, well, the first time I experienced the use of compost in sugarcane was down in Rocky Point Mill nearly 20 years ago. And we put a compost out there and we got yields of 120 tonne to the hectare, which was pretty reasonable down there. So then we said, well, this is working. And when I got involved in that, the guy who trained me, he said, Adam, if you're ever going to be a good agronomist, you have to understand composting. And I was dragged kicking and screaming to those compost heaps every week. And in the end, I enjoyed it so much that I set up with my father my own composting operation at Harlan, which is in the Esk Shire. We did that for 4 years. Then when we did further trials up in Ayr, we found that, even though the Australian average yield is around about 87 tonne to the hectare, there were good growers that were producing, 140 tonne. But when you add on top of that a quality compost and a green manure crop, you can make those nutrients more bioavailable. We were getting yields of 200 tonne to the hectare. So it's about reaching the genetic potential of the plant, and the only way you're going to reach the genetic potential of the plant for that particular set of genetics is to look at how we can make the nutrient as bioavailable as possible. It's not just about water solubility of nutrients that's important here. The plant absorbs nutrients and large compounds in many different ways. Endocytosis is one of them. There's transfer of large molecules across the membrane of the root. It's like a targeted movement of nutrients through microbiology.
What about through the leaves?
Yes, there are foliars, absolutely. We've known it for a while. There's movement of nutrient there. But I mean, in sugarcane, it's all about return on investment. You can spend quite a bit of money on that. It just takes a little bit more of a valuable crop to see the real endpoint of foliars. So yeah, look, it's an exciting period, I think, in agriculture. We've got to look at all these opportunities, and at the end of the day, we're trying to build a better community. So going and looking towards nature for inspiration, I think, is part of that step. It's what we call biomimicry. That's what it is. You're mimicking what nature does, and it's not about being I'm organic and I'm better than you. It's about, have you got the eyes to see what nature's really doing here? That's the thing that I fail in all the time, is that I don't see what some of those farmers see. Little changes in the landscape that they see every day, and they're not switched onto them until you ask them a question. They say, "Oh, this is what's happened." I went, "Oh, dumbo, that, of course." So that's what we've got to do. We've got to look more towards biomimicry, because that's how we get to the next level of productivity and profitability in farming.
Well, last night we had a lot of people there that were maybe small landholders. Some people just had backyard veggie patches. How can we take inspiration from, being able to create our own food in our own backyard in a healthy way, utilising the principles you've been discussing today?
I think reading is a really good starting point. There's a really good website called soilandhealth.org, and they have recorded, it's managed by a gentleman down in Tasmania. I think the membership is $10. It's nothing really. Anyway, he's got all the old texts and he's put them into a digital format, and you can read all the old texts. Now, you've got to remember that science 100 years ago was about observation, right? It wasn't about randomly designed with, experimental pairs and multiple replicates of experimentation. In the old days, it was about observation. This worked, it didn't work, record it, whatever. So you go back and read those old books and you start to see this is where they really understood a little bit about biomimicry. They were observing nature and they're saying, well, if we do this and we improve on that, well, then maybe we'll get this. And it all related back to organic farming principles.
Isn't that how we got permaculture as well?
Yeah, well, that came in the 70s with Holmgren and company, a process of, what do they say? Every good poet is a thief. And, there's often things that you think are new and fresh, but in fact they're old. I mean, you look at King's book back in the early 1900s on, I forget the title of the book, but he went around from the US. He was a professor of soils. He went across to Asia and he looked at soil and he saw how they moved their manures from the cities back up to the farming areas back in the early 1900s and recorded the whole, I think it was 40 generations or 40 centuries or something of farming, or I think it's the title. Anyway, it's in that soilandhealth.org. So there was the first example of observing recycling in Asia. That happened in Japan and Korea and China, moving the human waste back up into the a complete cycle. And when I travelled through Tibet, that's exactly what I saw. I remember getting onto the top of the plateau after travelling through the back of Nepal, and they're made out of clay, like a house on the top. It was a toilet block. So you climb up the side of the steps, you walk across the top, you're in complete full view of the village, right? you drop your pants, you sit down there and you're crouching and you're looking down and that's where all the manure was.
Long drop.
And you look, it was a long drop, all right. And you're looking at the Himalaya in this beautiful colour and you're thinking, where am I? And then obviously that material sits down there for the season, and then come springtime it's spread out and they grow their barley, and then from barley they make their grain, and it's mixed with yak milk, and they have this mushy paste that they eat. And when you're hiking at 4,500, 5,000 metres, it's got so much energy in there. So the combination of that glacial milk from the water, so that's glacial milk meaning it's water from the Himalaya that's mixed with rock fines, and then the combination of that plus their manures, and that's why they've been farming up there for an awful long time. And it's taking those principles, why is rock dust really important? It's first observed in the Himalaya where they saw the grounded up fines.
The fertility of the soils.
And that's what gives you your keeping quality in your produce. And it doesn't have to go out at high rates. It's only small rates, but it's got to be really fine. And so there's all these little dots you connect over time that are really important. So that you'll find these growers around the place who have observed part of or whole segments of each of these little stories, and they've started to apply them on their farm. And they start to understand why is biodiversity important? Why is farm design really important? Why is management of water across the landscape really important? Why is rotation? Blah, 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 blah.
How fulfilling is that for someone like you who has actually connected these dots over a number of decades, and then being able to share that information from all these different backgrounds with these people and seeing results?
It's very rewarding. It's also very rewarding to go travelling and to visit the different countries and go and have a look at these traditional farmers. One of the interesting things is to look at how long contour farming's been in play. Contour farming in its true sense, that's a true contour, has been going on for between 2,500 and 5,000 years. And that, I think, is incredible, that we've had a sustainable farming system in play for such a long period of time. And that conventional farming is only a recent thing.
Relatively speaking, yes.
Yeah, 1920s is when we started really getting off the ground with fertilisers.
So it hasn't taken us long then to end up in the position we're in?
Well, the combination of excessive population and deforestation and upsetting the water cycle, yes, that's a critical.
As well as extreme farming, looking for top yields to get the money that, wow.
Yeah. There's all these things that, even within my lifetime, you see the changes from when we were children. We were playing in the yards and seeing frogs. Well, not many people see frogs today.
I do.
You do, of course.
Yeah. Well, it's all about that, living in an environment that's conducive to supporting. And I mean, if you don't have frogs, that's not a very good litmus test on your environment, is it? What does the future look like? What sort of challenges are we facing to get to the point where you feel it's going to be enough to be sustainable?
Wow, that's an interesting question. Look, at the moment, we're under a lot of stress globally. There's an awful lot of stress, and you notice that particularly when you travel around, and you notice, like in Europe, through the Middle East. I was lucky to travel with a colleague of mine into northern Iraq a few years back, and we had to set up a composting operation there. This is the area where civilization began as such, and what caught my attention was that the whole landscape was denuded in northern Iraq. And they'd overgrazed it, right? They'd overgrazed it. There was hardly a blade of grass anywhere. And we're talking about, the two largest river systems, right? And of course, once you start seeing that sort of level of deforestation and then removal of the grasslands.
Desertification,
which is exactly where we're at here in Australia.
Yes, I've seen it in Western New South Wales and Queensland.
Yeah, so if you look at the Bureau of Meteorology, they have a map of the major regions around Australia. So in Australia we have desert and we're surrounded by grasslands. Now, the problem is because we've moved into single crops and we've gone into simplification of our farming systems, those grasslands have more or less been under severe pressure. So when you go through a dry period, our cycles in Australia are really clear. Long dry, then a fire, then a flood, right? And they get more extreme each time. So during that during the last dry period that we've had, you notice that you have to watch the temperatures. The temperatures come out of those hot desert countries, they go into the grasslands, and then they go across to the eastern fall. And so in other words, we've opened up the desert by mismanaging our grasslands. And this happens all the time. And then, of course, we've got an incised landscape where, because of the way we've managed right from the time we arrived here, you've got a lot of erosion that's occurred. So you've got this constant draining of the landscape, heating up, drying out, burning, draining after a flood event or a heavy rainfall event, and all that sediment just moves down the catchment. So we've got a desertification. We're regarded as one of the high-risk desertification regions of the world. There's no way we can avoid that unless we start having a strategic rethink about how we manage our land.
That's actually quite concerning, because when you look at where we produce our food and the areas we're losing, where are we going to go to with that? Yes. So there are great growers out there doing a great job, you know. What it needs to be is we do need to have a little bit of policy direction as well. I mean, there has to be a think from both the state and, more importantly, from a federal level, where we invest our funds and what things we support. And the more diversified the landscape we can create, the more the rotations, the more we can move down and adopting more organic principles. Doesn't have to be certified organic, the farming, but what we do need to do is adopt more of those principles. The more resilient that landscape becomes, the less sediment that moves, the less heating that happens across that landscape. How important is it to the land, especially the soil, those discrepancies or changes in temperature? How does that affect the land?
This is the big question nobody's talking about much at the moment, and that's the water cycle. You know, when you have green ground cover, it's evapotranspiring. There's a cooling effect of those plants. So if you go back and have a look at the original settlers and the explorers, they always talk about this mist that was in the landscape. You know, you have the initial rain, and then you got the evapotranspiration, and then a follow-up rain straight afterwards. And you can tell that by the old dairy farms that were established up and down the river systems. They were producing milk on, you know, it wasn't irrigated, it was just coming out of the sky. So as you clear the landscape and you simplify it and you drain the landscape, it gets drier and drier and drier, and then bingo, you start to switch off this water cycle. And that's what's happened. We've switched it off. A really good explanation of that for people that are interested in is to look on YouTube at the biotic pump. That really explains it. You know, there's a large-scale movement of water that comes from the ocean inland, and it follows forests, it follows transpiring plants. And this is why you get water in the central part of Africa, why you get into the Amazonia, why water moves from Russia all the way through to China. It's the large-scale movement of water created by the biotic pump. If we know all this, why are we delaying accessing things or changing the way we do things currently? Good question. I think part of the problem is we don't have visionary thinking in this country. Everything's based on a 3-year cycle. We need that to be rethought. Great. Well, let's see if we can move forward on that when next we meet. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, it's great. Thank you for your time. My guest today, Adam Wilson, talking about adopting organic principles to build soil carbon and the benefits it can have for all of us. We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. If you'd like to connect with us, please do so on YouTube, Facebook, or via our website, projectcatalyst.net.au. Project Catalyst is funded by the partnership between the Australian Government's Reef Trust and the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, in conjunction with the Coca-Cola Foundation and with support from WWF Australia.